Thank you and welcome to the North Fork Reformed Synagogue special presentation of, please, here's the name.
Roosevelt and Wise.
No, but the name of the play, The Court Jew?
Yes,
The Court Jew. I didn't want to say it incorrectly, so I apologize. But this is very, very special to us. I have to thank Jerry. He has been a member of this congregation for how many years?
founding member.
A founding member of the North Fork Reformed Synagogue. And over the years, we have had such pleasure, such honor to be present and hear Jerry's very, very special and inspired words. And today is no different. So without any further ado, the Court Jew.
Thank you all for coming, the synagogue for hosting us, and the church for hosting the synagogues. Indebted to a lot of people. The philosopher George Santayana wrote, "Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." Is that true? I'm not sure. But I feel that those who do remember and learn from history are just as doomed to repeat it. This afternoon, we're going to look at some fairly recent project events and hopefully get some insight in how not to recycle them. I'm going to start off, I'm going to give some background about both men and the historical moment, and then we'll open it up for discussion. I'm going to make some suggestions for topics, so feel free to bring up whatever you would like to. It's fine. Okay. You want me to close it, Steve?
If you lean back, just bring the mic back with you.
Okay. Okay, a court Jew, Rabbi Stephen Wise's relationship with President Franklin Roosevelt. Stephen S. Wise and Franklin Delano Roosevelt lived highly consequential lives, and the relationship between them was no less consequential. What the two men said to each other, or perhaps more importantly, what they didn't say to each other, as they sipped tea in the White House, influenced the lives of millions. Roosevelt needs no introduction, but Wise does. Roosevelt's reputation, like that of most famous men, is going up and down, but nobody needs to be told who he was. That's not so for Wise. Prominent rabbis, like best-selling authors, may have 15 minutes, in Wise's case, 30 years, in the limelight, and then they're forgotten. And that's the case with Stephen Wise. During his lifetime, he was so well known that the U.S. Post Office delivered mail to him was addressed simply Rabbi USA. Now, unless you happen to live on Manhattan's Upper West Side and walk by the synagogue, which he founded and was named for him, you probably never heard of him. Thank you. After his death, Wise's death, that is, the present synagogue was erected and named in his honor. Before that, it was a congregation without a home. Wise conducted Sunday morning services in Carnegie Hall for 30 years, and he always sold out. That's a very big space, so he must have been a very powerful draw to fill Carnegie Hall all those years, but he did. Now, as unlikely as it seems, Franklin Roosevelt and Stephen Wise, though coming from radically different backgrounds, cultures, and experiences, actually had a great deal in common. Both were aristocrats. Roosevelt was fond of pointing out that some of his ancestors were pirates in the South China Sea. It's something of an exaggeration. Though part of the family fortune did come from the opium trade. He could trace his antecedents back to the Dutch who sailed up the Hudson long before there was the United States, settling there and over the years acquired great wealth. Franklin grew up in the world of privilege, went to the best schools, graduated from Harvard, attended Columbia Law School. His family had status as well as wealth, and was not quite one of the 400 said to be the only ones that mattered in New York society. They weren't far from it. Wise had a very different background. He was born in Hungary, came here as a very young child, and he too was an aristocrat, but a very different sort of one. He was the sixth generation of distinguished rabbis who had secular clout as well as religious authority. His maternal grandfather, one of his few male ancestors who did not become a rabbi, made a fortune manufacturing high-quality porcelain dishes. Queen Victoria bought one of their sets of china. At the time and place, the rabbinical lineage was more highly regarded than being a baron. The Franz Joseph, the emperor of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, who liked people who brought money into his realm, had made the grandfather a baron. Title wasn't hereditary, but it was a title. Stephen Wise was particularly proud of his ancestors who participated in the unsuccessful Hungarian Revolution, striving for independence from Austria during the Revolution of 1848. Wise believed his own anti-authoritarian streak owed something to his rebellious ancestors. Both Franklin and Stephen were extraordinarily ambitious, both brilliant, both masters of the English language, both great orators, both highly skilled politicians, both handsome, both charming, and both had charisma. Both had major health crises at young ages that affected them the rest of their lives. Wise's health problems were psychological. En route to a pulpit in Oregon, he suffered a debilitating panic attack, and for years afterwards, he suffered a full-scale breakdown, necessitating him. He withdrew to Atlantic City, the hotel on the boardwalk, but he was so debilitated by whatever this attack was, he couldn't even walk on the boardwalk. In later life, he never had anything that bad, but somewhat attenuated, he had repeats. So I don't know whether this was neurochemical, result of trauma, or what, but there was certainly a psychological problem there, emotional. Roosevelt, on the other hand, had been superbly physical, first-rate golfer, highly accomplished sailor, a master of horseback riding, and competed in that area. And more or less what the life did his wife's uncle, you see all the power in his family. The uncle was President Teddy Roosevelt, who recommended the strenuous life. And Franklin tried and lived it, and actually had, till he was struck with polio that left him permanently crippled. Uncle Ted had lost his wife and his mother the very same day. Apparently, he never grieved. Instead, he handled his twin losses by wrestling, hunting, killing animals, boxing, and ranching. Went out to South Dakota for a ranch. Franklin handled his grievous loss somewhat similarly, but with less frank aggression, rather with denial and undiminished optimism became sort of his trademark. Even cheerfulness in the face of great pain, physical and emotional. Whatever one thinks of Roosevelt's political career, it's impossible not to admire how he handled adversity after he became crippled by polio. Both Wise and Roosevelt had outstanding public personalities. Both were greatly loved and just as deeply hated. Both were unfaithful to their wives. Roosevelt with Lucy Rutherford, and later with his private secretary, Missy Lahan. Wise with Helen Lawson, editor of Vanity Fair. Both were believers in a higher power, but neither was conventionally religious. Although Wise was the most reformed of rabbis, not wearing the yarmulke or keeping kosher, and was not a believer in an anthropomorphic God, he nevertheless a man of deep faith. While Roosevelt rarely went to church, he too had faith in a benevolent God, and that faith was unquestionably one source of their respective strengths. Both men were less than forthcoming about the serious health problems of their old age. Wise's minimalization had less public import than Roosevelt, whose uncontrolled blood pressure and heart disease played a large role in his misjudging Stalin at Yalta, the last of 3 meetings of the Big Three during the war. The most important difference between Wise and Roosevelt was the power differential. Wise had strong influence over many men and women and over many institutions, but Roosevelt was the most powerful man in the world. Wise met twice with Sigmund Freud. It's not clear whether he was there interviewing Freud, trying to recruit Freud to the Zionist movement, or there to talk about his personal problems. There's no record of what he and Freud talked about the 3 times he met with Freud. Wise added to his aristocratic credentials by marrying Louise Waterman, an uptown German Jewish heiress, descended from Central European immigrants 2 generations earlier who had done very well indeed in New York. I got it. Emily Lazarus, whose immortal words, sometimes honored among the rich in the option and the observance, are engraved on the base of the Statue of Liberty, was a member of Louise's extended family. Louise was no longer Jewish, rather attended meetings of the Ethical Culture Society, returning to Judaism after she married the rabbi. Both Franklin and Stephen liked to live well. Roosevelt had a Hyde Park estate, a house in Manhattan, summer home on Campbell Island in Canada, and membership in the most exclusive of New York clubs. Years later, Wise declined a speaking engagement in one of them because it discriminated against Jews. Both had the ability to persuade others to follow them, to lead movements of various sorts. Wise was considered one of the most powerful speakers of his era. Roosevelt uttered words that went down in history. For example, his response to Pearl Harbor, "This is a day to live in infamy." Both could be devious in pursuit of their political goals. Roosevelt more so. Both men were American patriots, believing in what's been called our civic religion, the belief that democracy, however flawed, is sacred. Although the power differential between the men was real, it's also true that Wise had his own sources of power. He was the most prominent rabbi of his day, the founder and leader of a synagogue, the most well-known American Zionist, the founder and longtime head of the seminary, and he put an indelible mark on all the institutions he was affiliated with. Like Roosevelt, he was driven, had enormous energy. He sort of what looks like a manic depressive kind of pattern, right? He's got this tremendous drive and then they would collapse. Both Roosevelt and Wise shared a not so happy experience, the traumatic death of their fathers at a young age. Roosevelt's father, James, was in late middle age and had a history of serious health problems. His death was not altogether surprising. Nevertheless, it had profound consequences, leaving Franklin a lonely child with a domineering, overindulgent, possessive mother. What role the loss of his father and this environment by his mother played in the formation of his character, I will leave to as many biographers. Both men knew how to relax, however. Before polio, sailing, horseback riding, playing golf, this is Roosevelt. After polio, working on a stamp collection. Wise each spring eagerly anticipated the arrival of clerical complimentary tickets to the New York Yankees season. Didn't miss many games. And he loved roaming in the woods around his summer home. Neither was conventionally religious. Wise's liberal Judaism, as he called it, she preferred to the title of Reform Judaism, had little regard for Jewish law or custom. And Wise's relationship with ritual was, what should we say, flexible. He didn't wear yarmulke, talis, payas, and he conducted services on Sunday, so working people could attend and didn't keep kosher. But he was deeply admiring of the prophetic tradition and related much more to the prophets than the 633 commandments from Orthodox Judaism. Nevertheless, he held on to enough of Jewish ritual to distinguish his form of Judaism from the ethical culture movement that his wife was involved with for many years, that she ultimately left it. So, and Wise in his own way, I think, was a deeply believing man, but as in all other aspects of his life, he was very individualistic in what he believed and what he didn't believe. He probably had a hard time getting the pulpits of that. Roosevelt, on the other hand, rarely went to church, except on ceremonial occasions. Nevertheless, on the night before his inauguration, his first term, his son James found him uncharacteristically disturbed, saying, "I don't know if I can do this job. I'm going to pray. Will you pray for me?" Not interested in theology or philosophy, Franklin described himself as simply a Christian and a Democrat, capital D. Franklin always remembered being moved during the divine service aboard an American destroyer off the coast of Newfoundland during his first meeting with Churchill as the lookout scanned the sea for German submarines. Wise's father, Aaron, had left his father-in-law's porcelain business to return to the rabbinate and then immigrated to America. After many immigrants did, he came in for scouting the exhibition to see if he wanted to move or not before he brought his family. And at that point, he worked as a laborer and a part-time rabbi, interesting combination. But he went back and he got his family and settled in New York. He soon had a full-time position as a pulpit rabbi, where he was both an iconoclast and a traditionalist. Stephen, who was playing a much larger stage, emulated many of his father's stances and shared many of his values. Perhaps his father's most powerful influence was his early death, which was never far from Stephen Wise's mind. Certainly brought his own mortality to frequent awareness. Now, it was said of Franklin's wife, Eleanor's uncle Teddy, the president, Teddy Roosevelt, that he was the groom at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. Although their narcissism was a need to always be in the spotlight, was muted and better packaged, exactly the same as true with Stephen and Franklin Roosevelt. They were not quite so blatant as Teddy, but underneath very similar. And finally, for both men, the most problematic aspects of their lives and careers came at the end. Wise's family quickly acculturated. His father made a secure, comfortable place for him in uptown German Jewish society. As a son, Stephen, as the son of the rabbi of congregation, Rodolph Shalom, Stephen had every material and cultural advantage, including learning Hebrew from his father. He had an older brother, grew up to be a distinguished lawyer after moving to California. His brother's death in middle age was a severe blow to Wise. I'm sure echoing losing his father at an early age. He also had two half-sisters from his mother's first marriage. Some biographers said they were from an affair, not from marriage. Who knows? Stevie, President Roosevelt was fond of calling him in private. In public, he was always referred to him as Dr. Wise. Went to the public school down the street, later to a public high school, and then enrolled in City College, quickly transferring to Columbia, more prestigious. At Columbia, distinguished himself rather surprisingly, the student of Latin and Greek. He went on to Columbia grad school, eventually writing a dissertation on the ethics of the 11th century Spanish Jewish philosopher Gabriela, who wrote in Arabic. So Stephen had to learn yet a new language after Latin and Greek. Now he had to learn Arabic, which was a very difficult language. Now, Wise was required to get his doctorate to study the original manuscript. It's in a library at Oxford University in England. So he went there. There was for a long time a controversy over his dissertation. Some biographers thought that it was ghost-written, essentially plagiarized. More recent scholarship doesn't support this and credits Wise with writing the dissertation. That brings up another issue. Wise's father, unusually for a European rabbi of his generation, had a doctorate from a German university. And Aaron wanted his son to be a scholar. It never happened. Although he became a master of English prose, Stephen Wise never wrote a philosophical or theological work. And Stephen himself had scholarly aspiration, but his talents lay elsewhere. And I wonder if his drivenness was an attempt to satisfy, and its placement to satisfy his father's ambition for him as a scholar, which he could never fulfill. Now, during Wise's European trip to examine the manuscript in the Oxford Library, there were two transformative events. First, he met Theodore Herzl. Very big deal. Like so many others, he was dazzled by Herzl, an account that moved him, having a mild interest in Zionism, to passionate commitment to Zionism that lasted the rest of his life. Herzl made him sort of American lieutenant, his American lieutenant in the Zionist movement. The two men met 3 more times before Herzl's untimely death in 1904. The second event was Wise's ordination and for private study with Rabbi Adolf Jelinek in Vienna. Jelinek was very well known as a liberal thinker, and the two developed a more than professional relationship, really friendship, something the father-son, and they wander around the streets of Vienna. Made me kind of sad reading that Vienna before Hitler, although there was certainly plenty of anti-Semitism, was a place where two distinguished Jewish men in different ways could casually walk around the city and enjoy the architecture and culture for which Vienna is famous. And a few years later, that was impossible. You'd be heading for a death camp. Kind of recurrent sadness in researching and writing this paper. Coming back to Stephen Wise, he was now ordained. He returned to New York to become a pulpit rabbi, and at that point he married Louise Waterman. She was highly cultured, very well educated, secure member of the upper class, uptown German Jewish aristocracy. She was also a follower and a friend of Felix Adler, the founder of ethical culture movement. Ethical culture was a serious competitor of Judaism around the turn of the 20th century and for quite a while afterwards. It retained and embellished the ethical and prophetic teachings of Judaism, but it left behind ritual customs and a belief in a divine being. That wasn't far from Stephen's belief system. Where Wise could not follow Adler was Wise retaining the belief in a transcendent God who was a force in human affairs to whom prayer was appropriately addressed, as well as the practice of some vestiges of Jewish ritual. Stephen's rabbinical grandfather had stood between strict orthodoxy and reformed Judaism. The grandson, Stephen, recapitulated being in the middle, standing between orthodoxy and ethical culture. Louise continued to admire and correspond with Felix Adler the rest of her life. If Stephen was jealous, there's no evidence of it. Seems hard to believe it wasn't, but at least there's no paper trail for that. Be that as it may, after a few years leading in Manhattan synagogue, Wise decided to follow his brother Wes in a secular job to rabbi of Portland, Oregon's congregation Beth Israel. Before following there, I'd like to mention two powerful influences, not only on Wise's career, but on a whole generation of liberal thinking people, particularly but not exclusively Jewish. And that's two movements of progressivism and the social gospel. The progressive movement in the late 19th, early 20th century was different from classical liberalism in one essential aspect, its emphasis on social action. Classical liberalism had defended individual rights, freedom of speech, and strongly supported laissez-faire approach to economic issues, giving the government little role in the marketplace. In Jefferson's word, it advocated a career open to talent, a meritocracy, rather than society structured around inherited position and wealth. The progressives, on the other hand, did favor government regulation of the marketplace, supporting muckraking, as exemplified by Upton Sinclair's bestseller, The Jungle, a book that exposed the horrors of the meat packing industry and led to the federal Food and Drug Act. The progressive also pushed for exposure of corruption and the breaking of monopolies. Their other goals included child labor laws, support for the rights of labor unions in particular, environmental protection, conservation. Wise was involved in all of that. Being a very passionate advocate of those causes. The Christian movement known as the social gospel thought that true piety is not so much about doctrine as about alleviating human suffering through social action. Its Jewish equivalent is tikkun olam, repairing the world, and was a natural fit, found support in the Wise's hierarchy of values. His lifelong Christian friend, John Holmes, the minister of the church in Brooklyn, who spoke at Wise's funeral, was an enthusiastic follower of the social gospel, and he was a major influence on Wise. Wise, for all his commitment to Judaism and Jewish affairs, never lived in an exclusively Jewish world. When he had a pulpit, he would invite Christian clergy to give sermons in his synagogue. People had often held positions he did not hold, but he wanted to bring in as wide a variety as he could. So he invited all sorts of people to speak from his pulpit. So to speak, he was a pioneer in what we would call the interfaith movement. Another social gospel that strongly influenced was another real character, an eccentric Scotsman named Thomas Davidson, who started, among other things, Breadwinners College, important institution. That was housed at the Educational Alliance. It still exists on the Lower East Side. Some of you may have been there. It was one of the settlement houses on the Lower East Side to attempt to acculturate and give immigrants, not primarily, but not entirely Jewish ones, a foothold in the New World. Eleanor Roosevelt and Louise Waterman had both been volunteered in various settlement houses, which not only provided social services, but also education. They had classes for working people in the evening so they could attend. They still do. And Davidson had found that essentially a college for immigrants, night school for immigrants in the settlement houses. At that point, purchased land up in upstate New York in the Keene Valley in the Adirondacks, the base of Hurricane Mountain I climbed. And he had a summer camp, Linmore, which was sort of a distant relative of the American utopian experiments in the 19th century, where young people participated in intense intellectual discussion, sang, read poetry, farmed, and wandered in the woods, and I'm sure made love. Wise spent the summer of 1882 there and heard Davidson teaching, knowledge and wisdom are not idols or fetishes to be worshipped, but rather instruments to be used for the welfare of others. And he told Wise, Judaism, like all living things, changes, it grows. You would bring the 20th century Judaism fitted to meet the needs of the present day. Stephen Wise never forgot what he learned that summer. After another trip to Europe, he returned to lead a Manhattan synagogue while still pursuing his Columbia doctorate and became engaged. At that point, he left Manhattan and went to Oregon. The congregation who took over in Portland was sparsely attended, on the verge of bankruptcy and without direction. He reversed all that. Wise's years in Portland was particularly successful. He and Louise always regarded him as the happiest time of their lives. Now, Portland was still something of a frontier town, wide open, corrupt, surging with energy. A port with thousands of saloons, brothels, gambling halls, as well as a thriving salmon cannery industry, where the working conditions were absolutely appalling. Sanitation didn't exist. The fishing industry was vital to Portland's prosperity, and support for cleaning it up, which Wise advocated, was, to put it mildly, not popular. Now, the surest way to become a millionaire in Portland was to become a precinct captain in the police force. There you could rake in huge amounts of money to ensure no interference with brothels, saloons, or gambling halls. Wise denounced it all from his pulpit, accruing enemy that his reputation grew. That was not a popular thing to do. When a reform mayor came in, Wise became a major figure in the attempt to clean Portland up. It was suggested he run for mayor, but he rejected all such suggestions to become overtly political, insisting that the clergy should have an independent role without affiliation with any political party. Wise also insisted there was no such thing as a Jewish voting bloc. Rather, African Jews should play an independent role by voting for the best candidate, Jewish, Christian, Republican, Democrat, whatever. Nevertheless, his sermons provided material and support for the reformers. Originally Republican, by his Portland years, he had become a Democrat. He consistently filled the pews of the synagogue and started speaking all over the West, even going as far as Alaska. By the time he left Portland, he had a national reputation. When Teddy Roosevelt came to town, Wise was invited to lunch with him. It was Wise's first contact with an American president, and a Republican one at that. Though he admired Teddy for his achievements, he was uncomfortable with Teddy Roosevelt's style, too impulsive, too much to loose cannon. Wise agreed with the Republican leader, Mark Hanna, who lamented after Teddy became president following McKinley's assassination. Now we're stuck with that damn cowboy. But Stephen did love getting close to power. And he, much like Teddy Roosevelt, consistently sought adoration and applause. Though Teddy and Stephen were both progressive, they had a significant political disagreement. Wise favored breaking up the monopoly Roosevelt favored, regulating them. That was a split in the progressive movement that lasted many years. More central to Wise's career and closer to his core beliefs was the issue of the proper role of the rabbi, or any kosher person. Was a rabbi to reflect the beliefs and values of his congregation and its trustees, or should the rabbi or other clergy lead rather than follow, challenge his congregation and boldly questioning its complacency with the status quo? Wise was adamant that the rabbi had complete freedom to express his beliefs in the pulpit. The leaders of his congregation were also leaders of Portland civic society. They were not comfortable with what came out of Wise's pulpit. There were corrupt members of the Portland elite, some of whom were trustees of the synagogue he was the head of. Now, Wise won that particular battle, and he succeeded in breaking free of control by the trustees. That wasn't true. So when after several years he returned to New York, was a candidate for spiritual leader of Emmanuel, the Cathedral of Reformed Judaism, really prestigious position. Louis Marshall, the chief operator of Emmanuel, who had status not only as one of the top of the wealthy society of uptown German Jews, but throughout the Jewish world. Marshall refused to grant Wise carte blanche to say whatever he wished from the pulpit, and Stephen would do his candidacy. Wise was then accused of grandstanding to get attention, charged that followed him throughout his career. And the leaders of Emmanuel insisted that Wise had no serious interest in the position, and furthermore, his prestige never actually censored any rabbi. Be that as it may, Wise was both lauded for his stance and condemned for it. Tagging because over and over again in his career at his hands, he had very strong critics. Always one saying issue with him being too much to grandstand or too much attention to himself. However, whatever was his motives is a serious issue here. Though unlike ministers and rabbis, he was not the spiritual leader of the congregation with a board of trustees of pleas, but a Catholic priest, Father Kaufman, who had a huge radio audience for his vicious anti-Semitism. For years, the Catholic hierarchy did nothing to silence him. Was this the case of the absolute right of a clergyman to speak his noxious, hateful hate speech? By Wise criterion, the answer would be yes. And clergyman, he had a right to do whatever he wanted in the church shouldn't interfere. I assume that would have been Wise's position. And that would have been problematic, to say the least. So this issue of how free the clergy should be to speak their minds is a real one, and it's still with us. There's things, Cogman's a very good example. There's things that clergy should not be free to speak, in my opinion. The struggle with Marshall, a bit of that battle that he lost, drove Wise to establish his own synagogue, the Free Synagogue, which still exists in New York. It was free in two regards. The spiritual leader had absolute freedom of conscience and speech. So say whatever there were no she's, and that he or she wished. And the seats in the synagogue were no longer purchased by the wealthy. Of course, got the best seats. Now, whoever walked in could take whatever seat they wanted. Wise felt very strongly about that, and he ended the practice of people being able to buy seats in the synagogue. Now, from the very beginning of the Free Synagogue, which is on the Upper West Side, Wise also held services in the Lower East Side, trying to heal the split between the uptown wealthy German Jews and the impoverished or semi-impoverished Eastern European immigrants in the Lower East Side. So he had services in both places. And he also hired a full-time rabbi to pursue his social agenda. Position still exists. Some years later, Wise was one of the founders of the NAACP. Shortly thereafter, he went to Messina, small town in upper New York State, where after a young girl went missing, Jews were accused of ritual murder. The only instance of a blood libel in American history. The blood libel is a belief that Jews murder Christian children to get blood to make matzah Passover. A dangerous fantasy that started in Damascus and spread throughout Europe continues to this very day in the Middle East. When the girl walked out of the woods a few days later, Wise demanded an apology from the mayor and demanded this from the police chief that started the whole business. Herbert Lehman, the Jewish governor in New York, also demanded that the blood libel be repudiated, and it was. In 1911, there was a tragic fire in a building on the northeast side of New York's Washington Square Park. The 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the building were occupied by the Triangle Shirtwaist Glass Factory, whose managers locked the doors to prevent the mostly Jewish and Italian young girl who worked there from stealing from the firm. When the fire broke out, they were trapped. 146 died, either from burn or injuries they sustained when they jumped from the windows. The Jewish owner of the firm fell for manslaughter and then acquitted on the highly questionable grounds that they didn't know the word of law. Must have had very good lawyers. Wise's response was first to demand justice for the outrage of the acquittal, and second to advocate for laws mandating safe factory working conditions. He wasn't alone, and the public outcry resulted in significant legislation protecting the factory workers. Wise's closest ally in the struggle for decent, safe working conditions was Frances Perkins, who became Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor and the first woman cabinet member. Wise and Perkins continued working together for progressive causes for many years. The owners of the shirtwaist factory collected a large settlement from insurance companies. They shared very little with the heirs of the victims. In 1911, New York University occupied the lower floors of this building. It still does, and I've gone to classes there. For a long time, it was a plaque on the outside in memory of the victims of the fire. Last time I walked by, it was gone. I don't know why I never took it down. Sacco and Jerry were Italian immigrants who were almost certainly innocent of a murder they were accused of committing. Wise became a leader of the movement and their defense. It was supposed to be anarchists and unwelcome intruders in America. They were convicted despite worldwide opposition and were executed. Somehow, in spite of being engaged on so many fronts, Wise managed to found a seminary, become a leader of American Zionism, even as he continued to support the progressive agenda. When Princeton University President Woodrow Wilson decided to run for governor of California, Wise not only supported his candidacy, but he developed a friendship with Wilson, and went so far as to predict that Wilson would become president, which of course he did. When Wilson became president, Wise became a frequent and welcome visitor to the White House. And when Wilson announced his support for the Balfour Declaration, in which England proclaimed that it favored the establishment of the Jewish homeland in Palestine, Wise's admiration for Wilson turned to love. Wise became a member of the Zionist contingent at the Versailles Peace Conference after the war. Unhappily, England was reneged with dire consequences for the Jews on its promise in the Balfour Declaration to support Jewish settlement in Palestine. Prefiguring as being blinded by worship of Franklin Roosevelt, Wise was incapable of criticizing Wilson. During the First World War, freedom of speech was severely curtailed. The Sedition Act of 1918 prohibited speech in support of resistance for America fighting World War I. Jacob Abrams, along with 7 other suspected communists, were arrested for printing about a bulletin denouncing America's participation in the war. He was convicted. His case eventually went to the Supreme Court, which upheld the conviction was a famous dissent by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who wrote, "When men realize that time is many exciting fates," referring to his fanatical belief in the wisdom of the work, "they may come to believe the ultimate good desire is better reached by free trade in ideas. The best test for truth, the power of thought, to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. And that truth, determined by competition in the market, is the only ground on which our wishes can be safely carried out." Famous and justly famous dissent. Now, one would have thought that Wise would strongly support the statement. It was essentially his own credo. He didn't, kept quiet, because he couldn't criticize Wilson. Having to repeat what wrote it. A few years after the war and the Russian Revolution, many immigrants were suspected of supporting communism and were deported, not very legally, as were those who were suspected of being anarchists. They were mostly, but not entirely, Russian Jews. Michael Palmer, Wilson's Attorney General, spearheaded the arrest and carried out a more general repression. Then a bomb went off in Palmer's home. There was a tribute to anarchists. There's a wave of arrest and deportation, very extensive. They were known as the Palmer raids, for Michael Palmer, the Attorney General. These raids violated the Constitution, guaranteed of freedom of speech. And even worse, they added to the anti-immigration movement that swept the country and led to the horrendous restrictions of the Johnson-Reed immigration laws in 1924. As far as I know, Stephen Wise didn't say a word about any of this. He was even silent when Eugene Debs, the perennial socialist candidate for president, who received more than 1 million votes in the previous election, was jailed for opposing the draft. Debs was eventually pardoned, not by Wilson, who could be rigidly self-righteous and vindictive, but of all people, by the Republican Party. In fairness to Wise, he agreed with Wilson that World War I is a righteous war against autocracy and a war that would end all wars. Perhaps even more significantly, Wilson was pro-Zionist, supportive of the Balfour Declaration. Wilson's Zionism was partly as well as religious beliefs, including the belief that the Jews must return to their ancestral homeland before the Messiah could arrive. Sounds familiar. Very similar sentiments expressed today by the Christian right. Wilson's passion for Woodrow Wilson grew even brighter after the president nominated Louis Brandeis, a Jew, to the Supreme Court. The nomination laid bare the intensity of anti-Semitism in America. The confirmation hearings dragged on for months.
People from Gaza.
The opposition was led by Lawrence Lowell, president of Harvard, and this is the Harvard alumnus.
Busy watching the Super Bowl, Israel started bombing Rafah, and they have been using all of their military arsenals. They used.
Okay.
I got him.
Okay, Lowell, the Harvard president, rationalized his opposition to Brandeis's confirmation on grounds that he disapproved of Brandeis's political philosophy. Brandeis was known as the people's advocate, but the real source of the opposition to his confirmation was his fearlessness. When Brandeis was finally confirmed, took a seat on the court, Justice James Clark Reynolds refused to speak to him because he was a Jew. When Brandeis retired many years later, Reynolds refused to sit for the customary photograph of the justices. He's also one of the four horsemen who found most of the New Deal unconstitutional, leading Roosevelt to try and add members to the court's nine. Then he was accused of packing in court, and it was proposed to expand the membership. Reynolds' anti-Semitism didn't hurt him socially. It was a Washington elite. An invitation to one of his parties was prized. Brandeis went on to become one of the few justices to be considered great. When Herbert Hoover nominated Benjamin Cardozo, another Jew and close friend of Stephen Wise, to the court, there was no fuss. He was easily confirmed. Brandeis had enormous influence on Wise, especially in reinforcing his already powerful Zionism. Brandeis refuted the accusation of Jewish dual loyalty by stating, "My Zionism makes me a better American. My Americanism makes me a better Zionist." Stephen Wise agreed. Perhaps surprisingly, Wise was a drive, a proponent of prohibition, a position he arrived at during his crusading days in Oregon. We usually attribute prohibition to reactionary zealots, but the truth is that Wise was far from being alone among progressives in supporting prohibition. If Wise had any doubt about the strength of anti-immigration sentiment in the United States during the reactionary 1920s that were soon gone, the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 placed highly restrictive quotas on immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, condemning millions of Jews to death during the Holocaust. The Johnson-Reed law was overtly and openly racist. Johnson himself was a crude and cruel eugenicist who used a pseudoscientific theory to justify its quota system. Unhappily, the immigration law, had widespread support. Even the Jewish Samuel Gunther's head of the American Federation of Labor supported it out of fear that cheap labor would hurt its members. Although Wise opposed the Johnson-Reed Act, it wasn't one of his passions. The Leo Frank case was. Frank was a Jewish factory manager in Georgia who was accused and convicted of murdering a young female employee. Wise was in the thick of a fight for a new trial. Frank was almost certainly innocent. His conviction an act of pure anti-Semitism. The governor commuted Frank's death sentence, but a mob that included upstanding members of the local community broke into the jail and lynched Frank. One reaction to Frank's lynching was the founding of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, to defend minority rights, explicitly but not exclusively Jewish ones. As far as I know, Wise is the only person instrumental in founding both the NAACP and the ADL. After the Frank tragedy, Wise's passion began exposing and tackling Tammany Hall, the political machine that ran in New York City. By then, Roosevelt was governor of New York. Wise assumed Roosevelt would be on his side. He wasn't. Wise utterly failed to enlist Roosevelt in his anti-Tammany crusade. Though the governor's spouse successfully enacted the progressive program Wise favored, there was no way he was going to offend Tammany, who we hoped would support him when he became candidate for president, and it did. Wise wanted Roosevelt to aid in its attempt to bring down the flamboyant, openly corrupt, and popular mayor, Jimmy Walker. not only did liquor flow openly in spite of prohibition, so did all sorts of other sin. Manhattan's leading man, Polyabra, entertained the city's political and financial elite. Turning to the arts in her retirement, Alka wrote a well-known, quite literate memoir, A House Is Not a Home, and was naturally close to Mayor Walker. You may not be surprised to find that Alka was Jewish. When Wise and his fellow reformers finally forced Walker out of office, with minimal help from Roosevelt, he fled to Europe, leaving Wise to say, when Wise goes after politicians, there's a run on steamship tickets. As much as Wise liked Roosevelt's policies, he was repelled by FDR's clearly opportunist refusal to move against Tammany Hall and Jimmy Walker. Wise's conclusion was that the governor was a man without principle, shallow, self-serving, and not to be relied on or trusted. So, ironically, first interaction between Wise and President Roosevelt was adversarial. When Roosevelt ran for president in 1932, Wise did not vote for him, nor did he vote for President Hoover. He cast his vote for the socialist candidate, Norman Thomas. In spite of the fact, in 1928, Wise had given a speech at a rally in Madison Square Garden in support of Roosevelt's candidacy for governor before he was disillusioned with Roosevelt. His support for Roosevelt in the 28 election, 1928, gave Wise entry into the governor's mansion, always gravitates toward power. Now, Wise had supported FDR for governor in spite of the fact that Roosevelt's opponent was Jewish. Wise insisted Jews, like everyone else, should vote for the best candidate and not as a member of the voting bloc. Wise was fine with pointing out that he had voted for a Catholic, Al Smith, for president. A Protestant, FDR for governor, and a Jew, Herbert Lehman, for lieutenant governor. Now, while her husband retained many Jews in South New York State administration when he was governor, Eleanor Roosevelt objected. The race has nerves of steel, tentacles of steel, has nerves of iron, tentacles of steel. Given the prevalence of anti-Semitism in the culture that Roosevelt grew up in, FDR was surprisingly friendly, at least in his professional life, with Jews. Eleanor was not. Returning from a party that included many Jews, she said, reflecting the stereotype, if I never see a naked diamond again, I'll be too soon. And when FDR brought the brilliant Felix Frankfurter, who was part of his brain trust film, her comment was, oh, he's so Jewish. Eleanor eventually became a Zionist and later a passionate supporter of the state of Israel. After Franklin's death, she fell in love with a Jewish physician, David Gurlich, who had many affairs, among others with Hemingway's third wife, Martha Gellhorn, also Jewish. Although Eleanor had erotic feelings for David, he, a decade younger, did not reciprocate him. After David married an old flame and fellow Jew, the three of them moved together in a kind of menage a trois. And the once anti-Semitic Eleanor Roosevelt ended her life with a mezuzah on her door. Eleanor later wrote of the night when their plane was stranded in Newfoundland, they meaning she and David, and they shared sleeping quarters. She went on to tell that lacking the nightie she slept in her panties, given David's life of lack of physical interest, but he did care deeply for her. It's unlikely the panties came off. However, I'm not sure I know wanted to give the impression they did. Her other great passion was for Loretta Hickok, an AP reporter who lived in the White House during World War II. If Franklin Roosevelt objected to his wife having a sexual relationship with a woman, there's no record of it. Returning to Wise, 1932 vote for Norman Thomas, the socialist candidate. I might note that I interviewed Thomas at the end of his career. I find him impressive, both as a human being and as a political thinker. By then, he thought the New Deal would accomplish much of what he had fought for his entire life. When I spoke to him, his political agenda was almost exclusively in stopping the Vietnam War. To turn back to FDR, since he's so well known, I won't go into much detail about his life before the presidency. As already noted, he was born to great wealth, doted on, especially after his father's death by his mother Sarah. Educated by private tutors, he went up to Groton, an ultra-exclusive boarding school. Its headmaster, the Reverend Endicott Peabody, remaining influential throughout Franklin's life, officiating at his wedding and giving the invocation at his inauguration. Roosevelt proposed to three debutantes, all of whom refused them. The refusal didn't seem to matter much to him. His great disappointment is not making the Porcellian Club the most exclusive club at Harvard, to which both Uncle Ted and his father belonged. Romantically, he tried again, proposing to his distant cousin Eleanor, who was considered something of an ugly duckling, perhaps unfairly. And the attraction of the handsome Franklin to her remains something of a mystery. I would imagine that he was drawn to her still undeveloped depth of spirit, nonetheless. In any case, in spite of his mother's opposition, he married her. From Harvard, FDR went to Columbia Law School, passing in New York bar after 2 years he dropped out. Eleanor made a snide comment about the Jewish phenomenon at Columbia that may have influenced his decision to leave the school. Now, Franklin practiced law without much interest for several years, and then ran for the New York State Senate and won. He had found his vocation, politics. In Albany, Franklin pursued the progressive agenda, easily winning re-election. In 1912, he supported Woodrow Wilson for president in a four-way race. Cousin Theodore having split the Republican Party to run as a bull moose, with the socialist candidate Debs having a significant following. The Republican candidate was William Taft, who had succeeded Teddy Roosevelt in the presidency. Yeah. People want to take a break? Or you want to start? Or you want maybe 15 minutes to go?
Finish up.
Finish that, okay. Wilson, when he was president of Princeton, appointed the first Jewish faculty member, and later when president nominated Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. Roosevelt felt that Wilson, whose family had been on the wrong side of the Civil War and was therefore a member of the minority, identified with another minority, the Jews. Far-fetched, but that's not impossible. Franklin's feelings about Wilson's support of the Balfour Declaration I discussed earlier are not known. Roosevelt had previously supported the Roman Catholic Smith, who he famously characterized as a happy warrior when he nominated him for president in the 1920 Democratic Convention. Roosevelt's anti-Semitism is cultural and seemed to apply to the race, not to individual Jews. Franklin Roosevelt had many close relationships, professional and to some degree personal, with Jews. He was particularly close to his Hyde Park neighbor, Henry Morgenthau Jr., who he appointed to his cabinet. Morgenthau's father had been Wilson's ambassador to the Ottoman Empire and young Henry had been an assistant to his father as the Turks turned on the Armenians, so he had direct knowledge of genocide. The Turkish attacks on the Armenians been overtly genocidal. Henry's identification as a Jew was initially weak, then grew stronger as Hitler's horrors became known. Eventually, Roosevelt's long-term Secretary of Treasury, Morgenthau Jr., that is, advocated from within the administration a much more overt, stronger support of the European Jews. To some extent, Morgenthau succeeded. One of his sons became a renowned Manhattan district attorney. I treated one of D.A. Morgenthau's chief of detectives, a working-class Catholic who had the highest regard for Morgenthau and his family. So, interesting little sidelight about reading the history book. Now, Roosevelt had no trouble working with his lieutenant governor, Herbert Lehman. That was true of his dealings with other Jewish politicians. And he appointed Jews to his brain trust and nominated Felix Frankfurter to the Supreme Court. On the other hand, when Roosevelt was on the Harvard Board of Overseers, he voted for a Jewish quota. Apparently embarrassed, he told Morgenthau he'd only voted for the quota because he didn't believe any one group should dominate any organization. That was absurd. He certainly did dominate Harvard. In fact, the Harvard president, Lawrence Lowell, has led the opposition to Brandeis confirmation as a result of the Supreme Court, which he rationalized objecting to his judicial philosophy, which was nonsense. The real reason was Brandeis' solution of all of his ambivalence and gratitude towards first view. Franklin Roosevelt did buy into the stereotype. He had a lifelong fear of Jewish dominance. As late as 1941, well into the Holocaust, he remarked on the visit to the West Coast, there are 200 Jews in the Oregon Federal Civil Service, and once said the German resentment of Jewish domination in a certain profession, law and medicine, was understandable. Roosevelt had been successful as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. He was nominated for Vice President in 1920. His secretary, Josias Daniels, a Southerner and an overt racist, had given Roosevelt a free hand to run the Navy. If Roosevelt had any feelings about his boss's racism, there's no record of it. Roosevelt ran with James Cox, who no one expected to run the presidency. Cox had been nominated after Al Smith failed to get the nomination for himself. The ticket failed abysmally. Rawling Harding, proposing to return to normalcy, easily won, only to be brought down by multiple scandals, especially Teapot Dome and Orley's fiasco. He died on a trip to Alaska. Some say it was suicide, others it was blood poisoned him. May even have been from natural causes, nobody knows. He was succeeded by Sergeant Calvin Coolidge, then by Herbert Hoover, who received many votes from Europe to remind his efforts to aid European recovery after World War I. Unfortunately, Hoover was passive in face of the economic disaster of the Depression, tracked by his party's laissez-faire economic philosophy. In 1928, FDR, after years of struggle at his retreat at Warm Springs, Georgia, had recovered sufficiently from polio to re-enter politics. He ran for governor of New York and won. Roosevelt figured, so to speak, the New Deal as governor of New York. He was the exact opposite of Hoover. His approach was to do something, try anything, didn't work, try something else. In 1932, the country was in danger of becoming fascist, or at least authoritarian. There's no doubt in my mind that Roosevelt saved the country from such demagogues as Louisiana Governor Willie Long and Charles Lindbergh. Depression, of course, was blamed by Henry Floyd, a violent Jew hater, and the anti-Semitic priest, Father Coughlin, on the Jews. Jew hatred was already widespread in the country, and Roosevelt himself was far from perfect in his attitude and fears, sharing the widespread suspicion of the Jewish race. As close as he was to Morgenthau, he never included in his social events of his high home. Such social anti-Semitism is par for the course of Franklin's class and generation. And it was common in other classes. In his pre-presidential years, Howard Truman's partner in his haberdashery store, Eddie Jacobson, was not welcome in the Senate. His wife Bess refused penetrating Jew. When Truman visited New York in World War I, when he was a captain in the Army, he wrote Bess, "Now I'm in Jewtown." Nevertheless, with some pushing from Jacobson, Truman granted Israel recognition with hours of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. For all his flaws, Roosevelt was much better than the alternatives, especially including Lindbergh, who was a serious candidate for president in 1940. Or would have been. FDR also appointed many Jews to high positions in government and gave them leading roles in brain trusts. Among his Jewish brain trusters were Benjamin Cohen, Robert Moses, Felix Frankfurter, Alfred Dahl, and David Lowenthal as head of the TVA, which provided cheap electricity to rural America. Perhaps more important, as speechwriter Sam Rosenman was even more of a court Jew than Wise. He consistently advised FDR to say nothing about the situation with Jews. Hitler was already in power. I'm talking about the late 1930s. Where Rosenman was coming from, I don't know, but his advice was obviously terrible. And enabled Roosevelt to take actions and non-actions he probably wouldn't do anyway. Now had a rationalization. One of the most important Jews in the circle told them to do nothing. With the advent of the New Deal, Stephen Wise did 180 because he was really opposed to Roosevelt and Tammany Hall and Mayor Walker. Did a complete turnaround. Forgot about Roosevelt's role in supporting Tammany and the protection of Mayor Walker. And Roosevelt forgot, maybe almost, that Wise hadn't voted for him for president in 1932. The two men, so to speak, kissed and made up. Wise never had the free access to Roosevelt that he had with Wilson. Nevertheless, he was invited to the White House 13 times, as well as having expensive correspondence with the boss. There was little policy disagreement between them, and Roosevelt was grateful for Wise's support in the form of speeches, articles, and his influence to promote New Deal policies. A word about their sex lives. In World War I, Roosevelt had an affair with Lucy Mercer. Eleanor discovered their love letters and would have been a divorce if Roosevelt's mother hadn't negotiated an arrangement whose terms included Franklin's agreement that he would never see Lucy again and that their marriage would be sexless, in fact, a political partnership. During World War II, Roosevelt's daughter Anna arranged a series of meetings between Lucy Mercer Rutherford, now widowed, and FDR. When Roosevelt's private railroad car, the Magellan, pulled up on Lucy's siding, the press corps played poker until Franklin reboarded, and they never reported a word about the relationship. You can't imagine that happening now. Roosevelt also had the longest hair. Some biographers disagree with his private secretary, Missy Lahan. After Missy suffered a stroke, Roosevelt supported her financially, but several visited saying he didn't like to be around sick people. His son James made a point of letting the press know that his father's paralysis didn't affect his penis. Who knows what the truth was? Now, his reaction to Lucy after she had the stroke, he supported her financially. That wasn't a problem, and very seldom visited. Such a reaction suggests a certain callousness in Roosevelt that may have had ominous consequences. Abel Harriman, who was a brain truster, an internet advisor, and later after Roosevelt recognized the Soviet Union Epigraph ambassador to Moscow, said, Roosevelt was the coldest man I ever met. Harriman was known as the crocodile, may not have been the best judge of character, and he had presidential aspirations of his own. The coldest man in the world has also been attributed to Harry Truman. Perhaps both men thought that a best be life. Stephen Wise certainly loved his wife, but that doesn't preclude him from having that other amorous encounters. Ellen Williamson, the columnist who became editor of Vanity Fair, wrote in her autobiography that when she visited Wise in his office, he pulled her down on the couch and made love to me with my gloves on. Odd thing to note, of course. And then asked me to get on my knees in a position of prayer, presumably to perform fellatio, but I refused on that occasion, implying that other occasions when she couldn't refuse. According to Ellen, Stephen told her, virile men should act accordingly. Lawson wrote there was a repeat performance several years later. In her autobiography, she gave a long list of famous men she slept with, making her account of her interaction with Wise kind of questionable. Now, Wise's identical salary didn't nearly cover the cost of his lavish lifestyle, so they employed a booking agent to arrange speaking tours. I can't help but wonder what Wise did on his lonely nights on the lecture circuit. In 1936, the direct repudiation of Belford's generation and the British were about to publish a white paper radically restricting Jewish immigration to Palestine. Roosevelt, almost certainly urged on by Wise, talked the British out of issuing it. Britain was Hitler's army and never present threat. Needed Americans being Roosevelt supported. Yet 3 years later, the British did publish a substantially identical white paper. This time, Roosevelt remained certain. Remained silent. This time, Roosevelt remained silent. No one knows if he tried to persuade FDR to repeat his stance in 1936. If he did, he didn't succeed. And Wise did not have the smoothest at first. He had a very personal feeling, but he quarreled with all sorts of people, including Chaim Weizmann, that later became the first president of Israel. These quarrels were ostensibly about ideological beliefs. But the truth is they were about prestige and power. And it's very ugly looking back to the Holocaust was proceeding. These men would usually spend so much time knocking each other rather than not clear that they had done anything, but not really fine. Going back to Roosevelt and Wise, there's noted in his public utterance, Roosevelt always referred to Rabbi Dr. Wise and thought that he was speaking. The Stephen attempted family intimacy, patronizing both during the prelude to the war, especially after Kristallnacht. American Jews, with the exception of a big part of the German Jewish elite, were not, as are often portrayed, passive. On the contrary, they organized all sorts of protests, including a mass meeting at Madison Square Garden led by Wise. I think you're coming here, right? Jim?
This is a letter. So this is a letter that Franklin Delano wrote to Dr. Wise. Dear Dr. Wise, Americans who love justice and hate oppression will hail the solemn commemoration in Madison Square Garden as an expression of the determination of the Jewish people to make every sacrifice for victory over the Axis powers. Citizens, regardless of religious allegiance, will share in the sorrow of our Jewish fellow citizens over the savagery of the Nazis against their helpless victim. The Nazis will not succeed in exterminating their victims, any more than they will succeed in enslaving mankind. The American people not only sympathize with all victims of Nazi crimes, but will hold the perpetrators of these crimes to strict accountability in a day of reckoning which will surely come. I express the confident hope that the Atlantic Charter and the just world order to be made possible by the triumph of the United Nations will bring the Jews and oppressed peoples in all lands the four freedoms which Christian and Jewish teachings have largely inspired. Sincerely, Franklin D. Roosevelt.
4 years later, Roosevelt wrote to Wise.
Dear Dr. Wise, the attempt by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party to rule Germany, to rule Europe, and then to rule the Western world was based on two brutal devices: organized terror and organized anti-Semitism. Terror put Hitler in power and kept him there. Anti-Semitism was the terrorist counterpart and propaganda. In the name of the self-styled master race, Hitler robbed first his own people, then the peoples of Europe, and tomorrow, by his own boast, he would have robbed the world. In the past months, we have defeated Hitler's plan for world conquest. We have recovered some of his stolen gains, and in the months to come, we shall recover more, and we shall meet and defeat Hitler on his own ground. Some of the sources of anti-Semitism in this country were created to serve Hitler's purpose. Let every American look to his own mind and actions, so that while we defeat Hitler's armies, we also defeat his poisonous propaganda. Whoever condones or participates in anti-Semitism plays Hitler's game. There is no place in the lives or thoughts of true Americans for anti-Semitism.
Who was the real Roosevelt? The man who voted for the Jewish quota at Harvard? The man who wrote those letters? Why to know? Now, given the circumstances, especially the strength of the isolationist sentiment in the United States, Franklin Roosevelt did fight Hitler and fascism to the best of his ability, but this was not directly supportive of the Jews. Although he did denounce what was happening in Germany, he was often accused of fomenting a Jewish war. So in some ways, Roosevelt had his hands tied. It was a part of FDR, what they're part of FDR that Craig Wise is approving. At the end of Roosevelt's life, in the next few weeks before his death, Roosevelt invited Wise to the White House to discuss Europe, and at the meeting at the King of Saudi Arabia, even saw it. And this was shortly after Roosevelt, that is, we never made reference to disability till the joint session of Congress. Excuse me if I said, I just traveled 10,000 miles with 100 pounds of steel on my legs. Something had shifted in Roosevelt's mind. Was a meeting with Wise not an occasion for deathbed confession, an expression of FDR's need for justification, an unconscious wish for Wise's approval implicitly saying, I didn't do my best for your fears. I did do my best to persuade the Saudi king to not oppose your settlement in Palestine. Now, Roosevelt was clearly split, pretending some of the anti-Semitism in his background, yet he was often ahead of virtually everyone else in his policies for the Jews. The Jews within his administration were also split. The speechwriters noted with fearful and anti-Semitic backlash urged silence in what they called the Jewish quarter. Felix Frankfurter, later Supreme Court Justice, took the opposite approach, consistently urged Roosevelt to take what actions he could. Frankfurter, in his later years on the Supreme Court, became critical of judicial activism, and his reputation suffered. But now, living with an active reactionary court, Frankfurter's fears the consequences of judicial activism seem all too well taken. Roosevelt deserves credit for bringing the country back from the brink of authoritarianism and leading a turnabout in American attitude towards the war against fascism. He had much to fight. Father Coughlin, Huey Long, Lindbergh, the KKK, traditional isolationism, the long-standing policy of no government interference in the economy. At this distance, he agreed to its New Deal programs, alleviated the depression, seemed undeterminable and almost irrelevant. What counted was Roosevelt's ability to take the country from despair and rage into hope and recommitment to a civic religion. Unfortunately, there was another side to Roosevelt, calculating, devious, and vacillating. Notoriously, everyone that spoke with Roosevelt came away thinking Roosevelt agreed with them, including Wise. Well, no one knew what Roosevelt actually thought. Then there's the story of St. Louis. The ship filled with German Jewish refugees came within sight of the lights of Miami, but wasn't allowed to land. Not even the land in the Virgin Islands, whose governor said he would welcome them. The ship returned to Europe. The passengers landing in countries not yet dominated by Hitler. However, about a third of them eventually died from the Holocaust. Roosevelt could have changed that, but he didn't. Wise doesn't seem to have been involved with the fate of the St. Louis. Roosevelt's most egregious failure was his inability or unwillingness to do anything to help European Jews enter America. America's failure to fill the already highly restricted immigration quotas is simply appalling. Unfortunately, it's congruent with our long history of sentiment against immigration into the United States. Lincoln feared the anti-immigrant know-nothing party that had a huge following. Then there was the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s, and the KKK hatred of immigrants, through Catholic and Jewish immigrants, culminating in the Exclusionary Immigration Acts of the 1920s. It created the quota system and the requirement of consul to prove the admission of every foreigner to the U.S. So the already very small quotas for Eastern Europe, where most Jews live, were never filled, not even close to being filled. with deadly consequences for the Jews. The blame for this is usually put on the anti-Semitic Department of State, in particular Roosevelt's friend Beckeridge Long, the most vicious, most visible, and most powerful anti-Semite in the State Department. The unfulfilled orders were acts of murder. Roosevelt, the boss, could have restrained or fired Long. He didn't. Roosevelt was influenced by Isaiah Bowman, a pseudo-scientific eugenicist and demographer who advocated dispersing the Jews, an idea that appealed to Roosevelt, his long-standing fear of Jewish dominance. Bellman wound up as president of Johns Hopkins University, an outrage I won't comment on. The Talmud teaches to save one life is to save the whole world, and to destroy one life is to destroy the whole world. By that standard, Roosevelt's unwillingness to fire Long or order him to fill the quotas was a failure to save many worlds. If Wise challenged Roosevelt inertness in regard to immigration, he made no mention of it in his autobiography. Roosevelt did do more in response to Kristallnacht than any other Western leader. He was Bill's ambassador, but he didn't break the diplomatic relations with Germany. Even after Kristallnacht, he continued normal commercial intercourse with Germany, and we even allowed German warships to refuel in California. And this continued right up to Pearl Harbor. In 1942, after the successful invasion of North Africa, Roosevelt met with Churchill and French, mostly Vichy officials in Casablanca. The Vichy government, allied with the German Nazis, passed anti-Jewish legislation, even put Jews in concentration camps. The French Vichy leader, Admiral Darlan, was a frank Nazi supporter, indeed a fascist, who was violently anti-Semitic. Yet the Allies thought they had to deal with him. They didn't want to fight Frenchmen, and they wanted to take possession of the French fleet, being extremely fearful it would fall into German hands. Fortunately, Darlan was assassinated, to be succeeded by Henry Gillard, who was anti-Vichy, but little any better for the Jews. Churchill and Roosevelt were told that most Jews had been released from the French concentration camps, and they seemed satisfied with that. When Roosevelt was asked if the rights, including full citizenship of Jews, should be restored by a French official, even one version went along with the Vichy claim they couldn't do that because the Algerian Muslims can have French citizenship. And another version, Roosevelt called the French version, the Jews take over everything, so it'd be best to restore Jewish rights. It would restrict North African Jews to their proportion of the population in the various professions. That's when he made his remarked that German resentment and Jewish dominance of the professions in Germany was understandable. And this in 1942, when the Holocaust was going full throttle. The only possible reaction to Roosevelt's behavior in Casablanca is disgust. It's beyond outrage. The following year, all North African Jews were restored to full French citizenship and equal status with them without occupational privilege. Wise almost certainly didn't know about Roosevelt's anti-Semitic statements at Casablanca. And the unlikely event he did, he said nothing. Now, in fairness to Roosevelt, his Lend-Lease program resulted in a reluctant Congress and American public in one of his best fireside chats. If my neighbor's house is on fire and I have a hose, I allowed him to provide the tanks that would enable the British General Montgomery to beat the Germans under Rommel, preventing the German armies from taking Cairo and seizing the Suez Canal with God knows what consequences beyond certain annihilation of the Egyptian Jewish community. Back in the US, Roosevelt refused to see contingent of Orthodox rabbis. Wise advised Roosevelt not to see them. They were an embarrassment with their wide brown hats, their long coats, long beards, and pale. It wasn't one of Wise's better moments. In 1942, Samuel Wells, a high-ranking State Department official, received a telegram from Gerhard Wagner of the World Jewish Congress, who was stationed in Switzerland, detailing the Nazi plans already in motion to exterminate the entire Jewish population. Plan which originally conceived at a conference in the Berlin suburb of Leipzig. Over half of the participants in the Leipzig conference had doctorates. So much for elite education institutions. Samuel Wells was one of the few State Department officials sympathetic to the Jews, perhaps because of his alcoholism and his identification with the despised minority as a closeted homosexual. Someone was supposed to follow to forward a copy of this devastating telegram to Wise as a way of making the telegram public. He never did. But Wise received a copy from other sources, and he confronted Wells, and then he got Wise to agree not to release the telegram to the press till it had been confronted by officials at the overtly anti-Semitic State Department. Wise agreed for God knows what reason, and he did not release the German plan for a final solution to the Jewish problem to the press. No one knows how many lives might have been saved, but may have been lost by Wise delay. After Roosevelt learned the horrible truth from another Jew representing the Polish government in exile, Wagner's telegram was passed on to him. That was 3 months after Wise received it. Did the delay make a difference? Like any counterfactual statement, there's no way to know. The Jews who died in those months should have had a chance to live through a possible alive intervention at the telegram in that public order. By then, Wise had a rival Jewish leader, Peter Bergman. Bergman, a former resident of Palestine, was a follower of the radical Zionist Vladimir Jabotinsky, who supported violence against the British to pave the way for Jewish immigration in Palestine. Indeed, they urged the creation of a Jewish army. Wise, for reasons both personal and ideological, fought Bergman tooth and nail. Wiseman believed that Bergman's militancy was counterproductive, fueling anti-Semitism. But Bergman and his militant approach was also a threat to Wise as a dominant force in American Judaism. Today, it's painful to read of the bitter battles between the two men as Jews have been led to the slaughter by the murder by the millions. The earlier classic Wise and Reform rabbis who oppose Zionism also appears futile, indeed pathetic. Finally, after the original telegram reached him, something was done by Roosevelt and his administration. This action was pushed by Morgenthau, who is now willing to confront Roosevelt directly on aid for the European Jews. Morgenthau now reclaimed his identity as a Jew, threatened to resign as Secretary of Treasury, and make the breach public. The president didn't take action. Wise also encouraged Roosevelt to take action, and he did. He credited the World War Refugee Board, which his credit would save in 250,000, mostly Hungarian Jews. The fact that the Allied armies were on the verge of victory certainly played a role in Roosevelt taking measures to save whatever Jews were left in Europe. His goal and his focus had always been an absolute defeat of Adolf Hitler and his odious regime. The large armies now getting closer to success gave FDR more freedom of action, and he did finally use it. Another issue that is still controversial is the bombing of the rail lines into Auschwitz. The American Chief of Staff, General George Marshall, opposed it, and Roosevelt backed his Chief of Staff. Whether bombing of rail lines with a safe and a Jewish life is questionable, but it would have been an important symbolic gesture, unfortunately, never made. Roosevelt's relationship with Zionism is murky. It's about support for Zionist goals, yet equivocated, not wanting to fight from the Arab or England. FDR told Stephen Wise, if you have been a huge success with the exception of a failure to remove King, even so, even 1 inch. In Roosevelt's account, he took a strong pro-Zionist stance. Other accounts are not so clear. After all, the West did need soil. That was the last meeting with Stephen Wise and FDR. Not long after, both men were dead. Writing this piece brought out many feelings in the predominantly sadness and sorrow. For all their brilliance, every attempt by Jewish leaders to do something proved futile. Rage and fear were my equally strong emotional responses, even as I had some admiration for the flawed human beings, Franklin Roosevelt and Stephen Wise, who had failed dismally. I wonder what feeling arose in your minds. Let me close with some suggestions for topics for discussion. One, what should be the role of the rabbi or any spiritual leader in dealing with social and political issues? Two, how should you speak truth to power, or should they not speak truth to power? That implies a question about how to deal with anti-Semitism, silence, protest, education, or forthright condemnation and active struggle with anti-Semites. Three, how much culpability did Roosevelt and America have for not helping the Jews of Europe? Four, with Wise at Hot Judah, the court Jew, more interested in keeping his privileged position than in helping his fellow Jews. And if so, his Wise life project let it all be accomplished. And last, Leo Pinsker, a 19th century Russian Jewish physician, famously said, anti-Semitism is an incurable psychosis. Was he right? Mike's open, so to speak. Yes.
Stephen, I won't be able to say it too long, but I just finished a book called The Jews Should Keep Quiet. And I'm going to leave this on the table there. It's a very, very important, I think, book to read because it's kind of like the flip side of what, of what we're talking about. And it was written by an Orthodox ordained rabbi who is now the head of the Holocaust Study Center. And that's his career is to bring all these Holocaust things to light. And what he said was one quick things I know he wanted, is that he believes this guy Nedloff, who's a rabbi, he believes, and this I feel is very important, is that Wise, with all his wiseness and his wonderful so, had a problem because he had a misplaced devotion to the president, and that would not allow him to go against the government policies. And his ego was very large, and it led him to conflict with other Jewish organizations. And I think this book is really important to see the other side of what Wise, we really thought he was so wise, which I'm not meant to say that, but it's called The Jews Should Keep Quiet, which is what Roosevelt said to Wise. He said, just, you know, it will look like you make everything will blow over. But just keep the Jews quiet, you know, just keep them quiet. So anyway, interesting. Yeah.
Yes, sir. So this point about this trade-off between expressing, being collective, being quiet. A couple of things. One is Roosevelt, you know, no doubt was president during the 20th in our lifetime, the most difficult time in the history of the country. And he had to be concerned with at least two gigantic coalitions. He had to be concerned with the coalition with the allies and other countries that would be sympathetic to the American cause. He had to be very cognizant of his own coalition. You know, one of the things I've been interested in, you mentioned you and Law, I think, and you mentioned Ku Klux Klan, but the Democratic Party was a coalition with southern states. And he had to be very mindful of keeping that coalition together, as any president had. So he had these two balls that he had up in the air, and you know whether he was or was not someone who had ice blood in his veins, you know, whether he was a cold fish or not, or couldn't figure out. He had to be someone very, very mindful of how that we move forward on that score. And I assume that many people in this room saw the movie Oppenheimer. And you remember in that movie, when Oppenheimer finally was able to get into, I guess it was the Oval Office, speak to Truman about the cardinal decision that had to be made. If you remember at the end of that scene, Truman was so upset about it. He turned to his Secretary of State, I think, or whoever it was, and said, "I don't want to ever see that guy again." Yes. So, you know, this is always a very, very questionable way in which analysis goes. You got the person who's making the decision has coalitions to deal with, especially that right. And then you have those that have access to power to make that. So I think we've done a really good job in terms of trying to see the nuances of what was the relationship. But it's a very, very complex thing.
Very complex, yes.
Thank you for a wonderful education.